Well, thank you all for being here. It's great to see a packed room. I'm glad I was able to eat and fill my teeth full of bread before presenting on video. Today I'm going to be talking about a project that I've been working on for 3 years, just finished in December, called Building Renter Wealth, Evaluation of Shared Prosperity Rental Housing, Program Design and Feasibility. And the purpose of this project was to first develop and then evaluate the financial feasibility and potential tenant benefits of a renter wealth building housing model. I had support from Ian Carlton and Jacob Strawn at Mapcraft. This was funded by the Shan Zuckerberg Initiative, and you can download the publication at this link, as well as all the rest of the Lewis Center work. The question that's really at the heart of this project for me was, what would need to change for rental housing to be able to build wealth and financial security in a way that homeownership does, or similar to homeownership? And before I say anything else, I want to make some notes about this project because I think this is a fairly unique project. One is that this is both a pitch for a new policy or program, and it is an evaluation of how it could perform under favorable circumstances. So, I want to be clear that I am not a disinterested party in this work, but I have strived to be as fair and transparent as possible in my evaluation and in how I'm presenting the results. Another point I think it's important to make is that if this idea seems wildly idealistic or utopian, which it may very well, I would have you keep in mind 2 points. One is that the average U.S. homebuyer could not buy a condo until the 1960s, and that required a lot of changes to law and regulation, even to make that possible. And also, there are limited versions of this concept actually in effect being piloted right now, and I will talk about those at the end of this presentation. In that same vein, I should say up front that while this specific model that I'm going to talk about for renter wealth building is something that I can take some credit for personally, I'm not the first or only person to come up with this idea or discuss it in a more general sense, and so I don't want to take credit for other people's creative thinking on this idea, and certainly not the hard work that's gone into actually implementing some of these programs already. So this is just my contribution to those efforts, one of many. Another bit of throat clearing here, I guess, is a disclaimer that our consultant really likes me to share whenever I talk about this. Basically, without reading this, I will say more plainly than the quote here, shared prosperity rental housing, which is a term I made up, does not exist yet in any kind of defined or widely tested form. And neither does the specialized loan product I'm going to talk about or a business model that takes advantage of it. So we're making a lot of assumptions about things coming together to make this housing model viable. The financial analysis is much more than a sort of back of the envelope calculation, but it is much less than what you might take to a bank to try to get a construction loan or a permanent loan for a project. But with all that said, I do think our findings are encouraging enough to justify trying this out more in the real world. I wanted to note also that we're going to be having a couple of podcast episodes on this in the coming weeks. So on March 4th, we'll be publishing a conversation about this report, a deeper dive with Professor Monkinen and Bob Simpson, who is a 20-year veteran of Fannie Mae, the government-sponsored enterprises that is responsible for a lot of the loans that people receive, and now works independently. And then a few weeks after that, we're going to be talking with Christopher Herman from Enterprise Community Partners, who runs their version of this program that they've already been working on for a few years. So you can subscribe to our podcast, UCLA Housing Voice, and listen anywhere. So what is shared prosperity rental housing? Very, very quick overview before I get into the details here. What it does, build wealth for renters by sharing in profits of the developers and investors in projects. When projects succeed, so do tenants. It is intended to level the playing field between homeownership and renting and reduce some of the disparities between owners and renters, which we'll talk about, and to make it easier for people to choose whichever tenure, renting or owning works best for them, and not really push people into homeownership specifically. And for those who do want to become homeowners eventually, this could be a way for them to save up for it more quickly. How it would work at a very high level again, project sponsors, meaning developers or investors, developers or landlords, would use high leverage debt, and I will explain what that means, to increase their profit rates, similar to how a VA loan or an FHA loan works for homebuyers. Access to that special financing would be conditional on agreeing to share profits with tenants. Tenants would not bear the risk of loss if a project does not succeed, and the day-to-day experience of renting for the tenant would be essentially the same as traditional rental housing. And tenants would earn profits that are roughly proportionate to their time spent in this SPR housing or rent spent while there. Some highlights from the study, which we'll get into these in much more detail in a little bit. These simplified financial models that we created show that shared prosperity rental housing could be feasible in submarkets. Again, assuming pretty favorable conditions and circumstances. In some scenarios, we find that tenants could earn back around 10 to 20% of their rents adjusted for inflation for shorter to medium tenures, and up to 40% or so for longer tenures. And when you compare that to a sort of prototypical homeowner in California, that's anywhere from about a quarter to about 100% of the rate of return on housing expenses. So pretty good. This model, importantly, is structured to be competitive with investing in traditional rental housing. And that was important for me, because if you're relying on subsidies, if you're relying on philanthropic contributions, people willing to accept lower rates of return than the market would normally afford you, then you're just not going to scale up this program to serve, hundreds of thousands of millions of people. You could serve a small number of people, and that could be important. It would be important for those people, but it's not something that can scale. Okay, should have been clicking through those. So taking a step back here really quickly, just to talk a little bit about what is wrong with the existing system, some of the reasons why I felt like it was worthwhile exploring this idea. As many of you are probably aware, homeowners in the US have about 40 times the wealth of renters. The median homeowner has about 40 times the wealth of the median renter. Home equity plays a very, very large role in that disparity, and that's actually particularly true for Black and Latino households. There are obviously selection effects at play here, and this disparity would not be so large if you just randomly selected people to be either homeowners or renters. But there's no question that owning itself does contribute to this disparity pretty significantly. So this is a positive thing for home ownership, not so much for renting, and it's something we're trying to address with this kind of model. Home equity, though, is very concentrated among the wealthy. So what we're seeing here is home equity median and average at different quartiles of net worth. And really, just to kind of summarize here, what you're seeing is every time you go from one quartile to the next, from the bottom 25% to the next 25 percentile, you're roughly doubling or tripling the average and median home equity. And once you get up to the top 10%, you're looking at about, this is a fifth as many people as are in the bottom 50%, and yet they own 3.5 times the home equity of that bottom 50%. And this is actually getting worse over time. So this is a picture of how housing wealth is growing more concentrated, with the share owned by households who earn under 200% of area median income declining in the decade from 2010 to 2020, and the share owned by households earning above 200% AMI has increased pretty sharply. Home prices are also becoming more volatile. So this is what this basically means is there are bigger wins when you win and bigger losses when you lose in the housing market. And these lines just show the change in inflation-adjusted home prices for homes purchased 2, 5, and 7 years earlier. And you can just see it's almost like a kind of bullwhip thing where it just gets wider each time it cycles. Homeownership has never been within everyone's reach, and that is especially true in California. We tend to talk about homeownership as this thing that everyone aspires to. We want everyone to become a homeowner, but we've never cracked about 70% homeownership nationally, and the California ownership rate has persistently been about 10 percentage points below that. The point here is just that there are millions of households in California and tens of millions across the country who are renting at any given time. And the reality is many will never own for many reasons, but our policies and our discourse tend to assume that everyone eventually will. And so those people often end up getting ignored. The homeownership gap in California is also largest for people under 45. If you look at that area circled or squared by red, you can see, well, I'll just explain this a little more from the start. So what you're looking at is the US ownership rate by age bracket in greenish, and California is in pinkish. 2000 is the darker shade, 2023 is the lighter shade. And so the main thing I want to draw your attention to here is just that the biggest ownership gap between California and the nation is in the under 45 age bracket, which shouldn't surprise the people in this room. And of course, you can also note that it is declining. The ownership rate is declining for every age group except people 75 years and older. And it's probably the growth in that population overall that helps explain why the overall ownership rate has been pretty stable and even increasing in recent years. That is not the case for most age groups. This is kind of a messy chart, so I apologize. But the message here is just that there is a big ownership gap between white households on the one hand and Black or Latino households on the other. Those gaps have been fairly stable across the decades at the national level, but they have actually, and those are the solid lines, but they've actually grown wider in California over the decades. A lot of this is like reasons why homeownership is not all it's cracked up to be sometimes. But there's also reasons that renting is actually just good in its own right. One reason it is much easier to pick up and leave for a new job, for family changes, things like that. Because of the difficulty of moving, ownership is generally associated with lower mobility and longer commutes, among other things. There are much lower transaction costs to moving as a renter. There's no down payment, really just like a security deposit, first month rent. Rents are generally lower than ownership costs for similar homes. This is especially true right now with interest rates where they're at. And the SPR, Shared Prosperity Rental Program, is not really focused on affordability per se, unlike most of the work that we do at the Lewis Center in the housing space. But you really cannot overstate the role of rising prices as a barrier to ownership. We're not really going to talk a lot about that, but that's clearly underlying all of this. As a renter, someone else is responsible when things break, which is pretty nice. And lower property values typically mean lower rents for you as a renter rather than declining wealth for you as a homeowner. And I think one way of thinking about programs like this is they are a way of protecting tenants and helping them capture some of the upside, whether the market gets hotter or it gets colder. So my perspective, not everyone feels this way, but many do. I would say homeownership is not the best option for everyone at all points in their lives. I actually don't think that's very controversial. We should help people become homeowners, I think, if that's what they want. But there are real risks and costs associated with homeownership, and we should be clear about those. And we should not tilt the scales too far in favor of homeownership. But it is hard to resist doing so when the wealth building disparity between ownership and renting is so large. It's really hard to advise someone to just rent forever when they have to think about financial security in the future, having a pretty weak social safety net, not building enough housing and rents keep going up. Like that's not necessarily a great recommendation. So coming back to this guiding question, what would we need to change for rental housing to build wealth and find financial security similar to homeownership? The idea underlying this, I'm going to kind of give a little primer on the very most basic elements of rental housing finance, and that is about all I'm qualified to explain. I want to be clear, this is very, very oversimplified, but it is hopefully just enough to make sense of the concept here without bogging us down in a bunch of unnecessary details. So, why does ownership of housing build wealth, but renting does not? One big reason is homeowners invest a down payment and then they bear the financial risk if property values fall. For rental housing, it's the owners or investors who are responsible for the down payment for their version of it, and they risk loss. But home buyers and rental investors can't access the same loans, importantly. The quote unquote down payment, which is the equity investment that a rental investor makes, is much larger than what home buyers have to make. So for a rental investment, about 40% of the money is coming out of your own pocket as an investor. It's effectively a 40% down payment. For homeowners, home buyers, that can be 20% as low as 0% for a VA loan or 3.5% for an FHA loan. And so what this means, and I'll give an example of this, is that investors have to actually earn larger profits to achieve the same target return. And that will make more sense after we get through this, hopefully. So this is an example of that using a hypothetical $10 million multifamily development project as an example. What we're seeing here is for a typical project, about 40% of the funding is going to be equity, which we can say roughly those investors might require a 15% rate of return. They require a higher rate of return than a loan because they're making their investment earlier and they're being paid back last. And so they have a much higher risk of losing some or all of that money. And so in exchange for taking that higher risk, they're going to demand a higher return. The bank comes in later with a loan and they get paid back first, including if the project does not succeed as much as hoped. And so they have much lower risk of losing money. And so they demand a lower return in the form of the interest rate. We'll say it's 9% here. For that $10 million project, for both the bank and the investors to be paid back at their target rates, you have to have a sale price of $13.2 million. This is, we're not going to get into exactly how this calculation is done. It's oversimplified, but $13.2 million. In addition to just paying back the investors and the bank what they gave in the first place, there's another 2.1 million going to the investors and 1.1 million going to the lender. If you sell that project when it's completed for $13.5 million, you have a $300,000 surplus, and that's just going to go to the investors and the developer. With a high leverage project, if you were able to reduce that equity share to 10% and increase the debt to 90%, the required sale price to pay everyone back is $12.2 million. And that is a 75% reduction in the profit you have to pay to the investor because their investment has shrunk by 75%, and only a 50% increase in what you're paying to the bank. And what you were paying to the bank was smaller in the typical project. And so there's no reason in this circumstance that the project would sell for less money. It's the same project. So we assume it still sells for $13.5 million. That leaves us with $1.3 million in surplus. And that is the money, at least some of which could be shared with the tenants. So as I mentioned, the federal government already guarantees high leverage loans to promote home ownership. And so the question being asked by this project is why not do something similar to support renters? To be clear, guaranteeing these kinds of loans does come with risk, as it does with home buyers, but that's something we've just decided we are comfortable with to promote homeownership if it helps people buy homes. And my argument is that if we're willing to take on that risk to help what is, relatively speaking, pretty affluent people, home buyers, who on average homeowners have about twice the income, where the median income of renters is about half as much as the median income of homeowners. So if we're willing to go to those lengths to help homeowners who are already doing relatively well, maybe we should do something similar to help renters. Also want to point out, this is a way of one reason I put this high leverage loan idea at the center of this project is it is a way of funding these kinds of projects without diverting resources from things like the low-income housing tax credit, from housing vouchers, from programs that are directly funding low-income households and renters in particular. You really don't want to be in a position where you're competing for those things because a lot of the renters in this kind of program will be more like median income, for example. And I don't think it's in anyone's interest, certainly not something I would advocate for to take away money from low-income housing, rent assistance and construction and so forth to fund something like this. So as for how we evaluated these different business models, we wanted to test this high leverage loan SBR model against the traditional model that does not share profits with tenants. In terms of what we tested different production methods, development versus acquisition, different building typologies, different submarkets, different loan terms, different ownership structures, different profit distribution between tenants and investors and sponsors. Lots of different things here. Not super important to get into the weeds there. But to explain how our preferred model works a little bit further, essentially, as I said, the project sponsor agrees to share profits, and those are shared with tenants according to a predetermined structure. And in exchange, they get access to these high leverage, reduced interest financing. The sponsor collects 100% of profits up to a relatively low threshold, for example, a 10% return, which is what we use here. And then they split the remaining profits, essentially, however much they are, whether it's a lot or a little, 50-50 with the tenants indefinitely. The cash that is extracted to fund all of this is from refinancing the project every 7 years as the property value increases. So how do we evaluate the performance of these different models? We're really looking on the sponsor investor side at two things. One is, does the SPR model earn at least a 14% rate of return? And does it meet or exceed the IRR, internal rate of return, of the traditional rental model? So the first question is just, is it a good investment overall? And the second question is it as good or better an investment than just putting your money into a traditional rental project, whether you're building or acquiring? If the answer to both is yes, then the model is at least potentially viable. And this is just an example of 4 of the scenarios that we tested, and these 3 with the bluish greenish arrows all meet this threshold. What you're seeing in the last column on the left side is the IRR. You're trying to hit 14% there. And then on the right side is how it compares to the traditional model. So 99% means it performs 99% as well as the traditional model in that same scenario. 189 means it performs almost twice as well. So as I said, these 3 are 3 of the, I think, 6 that meet these thresholds. This one, the Oakland acquisition tuck under project, as you can see, it's got the 189% relative to the traditional model. It's much better than investing in a traditional project in this same scenario, but it's still under 14% IRR, so probably no one would do it still. So that's the distinction we're making and why both of these things are important. So the most important question, obviously, is how much do tenants earn? What do the tenants get out of this? Assuming things go right. So in terms of how these profits are accrued and distributed, once again, just going to explain another aspect of this before I answer the question. We try to keep this as simple as possible in the model. Tenants earn 1 rental reward per year that they live in SBR housing. The payments are made to them each year proportionate to each tenant's share of the rental rewards. So just for example, a tenant living in a 100-unit building during the first 5 years of the project would accrue 5 rental rewards for themselves. 500 would have been accrued total by all the tenants, and so they would have 1%, and they would receive 1% of the payments in that year. As I mentioned, because of the refinancing approach here, much larger payments occur every 7th year, and that's illustrated here. This is for one of the scenarios. In blue, the annual payments per rental reward, if you are just taking whatever you receive that year and immediately sending it back out. The pink is if you were to average things out so you're paying something more consistently. All right, so how much of the rent could tenants earn back? This, as it says here, it really, really does depend, and this is a surprisingly hard question to answer straightforwardly. By one metric, a typical case is 25 to 50% of rent paid back by the time your rewards expire, let's say. Um, but if you look at this table, those percentages are the percent rent paid back, and you're looking at anywhere from about 25 to almost 200%. And this is mainly just to illustrate how much your assumptions really matter, and how much they affect the outcome for any specific tenant you happen to be looking at. There's a lot of questions that you need to be able to answer, like, for example, do rental rewards have a vesting period where they don't count for anything until you've lived there, say, 2 or 3 years? How long do they last before expiring? How long does the tenant live in SBR housing? And how long does the average tenant live in SBR housing? Because if your expiration policy is based on how long you live there, then if you happen to be somewhere where most of the tenants have been there a very long time, that's actually going to mean you're going to get less. Versus if there's a lot of turnover in your building and you happen to be the one who is there a long time, you're going to earn more. So that 25 to 50%, I think that can be a little misleading, because it is looking at, you live in shared prosperity rental housing for some defined period, you move out, and you keep collecting these payments until your rental rewards expire. That can be a little misleading because if they move out, then they still have to live somewhere. And so we're not really counting the rent that they're paying somewhere else. And so I prefer this comparison to a typical homeowner. And this is more of an apples to apples comparison. And what it does is it shows total expenses, or it takes into account total expenses and total amount paid back for, and this is just during the tenancy, during the period of ownership. This includes the sale proceeds for the owner when they sell at the end. Um, and I'm just going to direct your attention to the dark blue line, which represents the homeowner here, and the pink line, which represents the SPR tenant. And what we see is that the SBR tenant returns range from about 10 to 40% of housing expenses, and anywhere from about 25 to 100% of the rate of return for the homeowner. And it really depends on the length of time. You can see they're much closer together in the first years and the later years. In the middle, it's much more of a gap between the owner and the renter. The first couple years are actually better for the renter because if you buy a home and then sell it a year later, you are losing money based on transaction costs. Even if you had 10% appreciation, you're going to lose money because there's just a lot of costs associated with buying and selling a home. So other than that, there's a few other things to keep in mind here. Aside from the financial benefits, obviously the renters keep the flexibility to freely move, even in a buyer's market, even when interest rates are high. And they benefit one way or the other, whether rents rise or fall. If property values, rents are falling, then they're just paying less. If rents are rising, then they're paying more, but also that means the project is more profitable, so they're actually getting some of that back. So again, there's a benefit in both directions. And always important to keep in mind, we really are comparing this to traditional renting where you get nothing at all. So just a reminder, shared prosperity rental housing, this is not about trying to beat homeownership at the wealth building game. It is just trying to level the playing field a bit. Homeownership is much riskier for the home buyer than SBR housing is supposed to be or intended to be for renters. And so we should expect higher returns to homeownership. Coming near the end here, I just want to bring up a few of the obstacles and opportunities that I could not spend a lot of time on here, but get a lot more attention in this report. I forgot to mention this at the beginning, but this is a 170-page report. There is a lot in here. I'm doing my best to consolidate and only touch on the sort of most important things, but there's a lot more that is discussed in that report. And I was thinking also this might help Jose with some questions too, because these are open questions that I still am working through and I think need to be worked through for this kind of program. So some notable obstacles and concerns that have come up in my conversations with people. On the one hand, this higher leverage approach, this higher loan to value approach, does mean larger rates of return for the same amount of profit, but it also means bigger losses when things go badly. So that might require that for people to want to invest in this SPR model versus the traditional model, actually they earn higher return, a higher return on investment than the traditional. That might be what's needed to induce them to participate. This model also, in addition to the higher loan to value, assumes lower interest loans, and those would require more explicit subsidies. That's not something you can just get by having Fannie Mae guarantee these loans and buy them up once they're issued. That said, I think there are alternatives to lower interest rates that would not have a direct, would be more of an indirect cost to tax expenditure. Things like faster depreciation for tax purposes or tax exempt debt, for example. Another question is, this could be a very administratively complex program. How do you manage that? Especially as the years go on and more people have these outstanding rewards and you're trying to pay all of them, even if they don't live in your building anymore. Would renters in SBR housing be considered investors? This was something that came up with our consultants, with many people that they talked to. If you are renting in this building and seeing it as there's potential for me to be paid back based on the success of this building, at some level, you are an investor. And the SEC, the Securities Exchange Commission, does not look highly upon that kind of model if the people participating are not accredited investors, which requires you to make $250,000 a year or have $1 million or more dollars in the bank. Most people just would not qualify for that. And so how do you get around that? And this goes back to my comment at the very beginning about condos. This was a concern for condos early on too, and we had to change the laws to make it something that people could actually buy. How do we ensure that SBR tenants don't pay above market rents? You could very easily imagine if there's a 2-bedroom apartment that is $2,500 traditional rental, no chance of getting any money back, and exact same building next door, I'm probably going to be willing to spend more than $2,500 a month to live in there. But there's a chance that that project does not earn a profit and I get nothing. And so I'll actually be worse off. And so how do you control rents in such a way where the SPR projects are not able to charge more? This is probably the most challenging question for me. I do not think there is a strong answer to this. There are rent indexes in other countries. Those are very complicated. I think this is part of why some of the, maybe both of the big pilots so far have focused on income restricted housing, where this is just less of an issue. They don't set the rents to begin with. And then what happens if a project is not profitable or is foreclosed upon? I think it would be pretty straightforward to design this kind of program so that none of that liability falls on the tenants. But it is still it just sucks. And it would seem unfair too, because it's really out of the hands of the tenants, obviously. But you could say the same about homeowners. You could say the same about multifamily rental investors. A lot of what happens to their investments is really about the broader market and not about their building. Thinking about some potential advantages and opportunities, smaller equity investments could attract smaller and more local investors. There's a obvious social benefit, potential reputation boost that could increase interest in this kind of program, in investing in this kind of program. SBR housing would likely have lower turnover and better upkeep. You could imagine the people who live there wanting to stay there longer, wanting to take good care of it, because there is actually a direct financial incentive for them to do so. Really important point, our financial models here only allow this up to 90% loan to value loan product for the permanent loan. And for development projects, you get a construction loan to fund construction, and then you get a permanent loan or a takeout loan once the project is complete and it's all leased up. And so what that means is that in this model for the development projects, you're actually still having to come up with about 40% equity during construction. And that's going to be a big barrier, obviously. And so there's reason to think that this might initially, in particular, be a much better investment and just easier for people just trying to acquire existing multifamily housing rather than build it for this purpose. all of this is in the report, I should say, but um, the model in the report is very market based for the reasons I talked about, but there's no reason this could not also be tried in many other ways. You could have a nonprofit cooperative that uses this model. You could have a public sector led program. Something that came up a lot was single family build to rent. Everyone knows about single family rentals. I think they're unnecessarily demonized in many ways, but if there was a clear path to ownership, that might change people's views on them and might actually increase the market for them and the demand for building them. On that subject of what happens if your project, the one you happen to live in, does poorly, I think a portfolio approach is a really interesting possibility here, where rather than it just being one owner investor has one building and the tenants live or die based on how well that project does. If you had a portfolio of dozens, hundreds of projects, and the profits were distributed according to how the portfolio overall did, it would really be like much more of a truly shared prosperity model, which I think is an interesting opportunity. And just to note that we do not capture the benefits of time or stress saved from not owning a home. Last section here. I just want to share a few details on real world pilots of this shared prosperity rental model, though they of course have their own names for it. First up is the Renter Wealth Creation Fund from Enterprise Community Partners. They are raising, and I've already raised a lot of this, up to $500 million from philanthropic and private investors to acquire housing that's affordable to people earning between 50 and 120% of area median income. Tenants receive cash back every month. They receive resident services like financial literacy and other things. And they have shared appreciation when the project is sold, which is expected to happen within 8 or 10 years. The investors get 4% before any money goes to the tenants, other than the monthly cash back. But after that, it's mostly goes to the tenants. So, and to be clear, a 4% return is extremely low. And this is being done by people who are just like socially motivated to try this out and benefit tenants. It's not something you could get billions and billions of dollars for. Last, I talked to Chris Herman. They're going to find out more about this when we talk in a week or two. Is they had already acquired at least 7 buildings, and they're learning a lot of surprising things. In fact, about like it's actually harder to get people to sign up than you think. It's free money, right? And yet people are skeptical. And so how you get people on board is a real question. Something I want to point out here is this, again, relies on investors who are accepting significantly below market returns, which is going to limit the scalability of this. But it also does allow targeting of lower income households, and it's, among other things, a great opportunity to test this concept. The other one I want to talk about briefly is the state of Colorado's renter rewards program, which sounds very similar to our rental rewards. Colorado voters approved Prop 123 in 2022, which dedicates 10% of the state budget surplus when one exists to housing initiatives, including this thing called a tenant equity vehicle. In this program, which literally just kicked off this month, tenants receive 2% cash back with a savings match, so up to 4%, positive credit reporting, and future equity distributions. And it's not clear how much those future equity distributions would be. Here it looks like 3 times as much as the cash back, but I'm not sure if this is actually intended to be illustrative or not. As I said, they acquired their first property just this month. I learned about this from like a press release from the governor. This program relies on public subsidies, so similar limitations to scale, but it does create opportunities that are not available to profit-driven models. Last thing I want to say here, a lesson from both of these pilots, which did not occur to me while writing the report, is the importance of showing tenants immediate benefits. Detail I did not get into here is how our modeling generally did not show SBR buildings starting to able to throw off profits to tenants until at least year 10 or later. And even if the financial benefits are quite large, which in this case we found they could be, that is a long time to wait, and that's especially true for a program that does not have a track record. The Enterprise and Colorado programs both address that by providing not a large, but a meaningful amount of cash back from day one. And I think that'll be important for building trust, firstly, for this kind of program when it hasn't been tested and there's not much of a track record. But I think it's also just a fact that renters are often pretty financially precarious. And in those circumstances, a little bit of money now goes a lot further than a lot of money a year or 5 years or 10 years down the road. So this is just one example of the kind of things I'm personally excited to learn about as these models are tested out, things we might not have thought about up front, even if we spent 3 years and wrote 200 pages on it. All right, Jose, back to you. Thank you.
Right. So
Do we need him to speak into something so people can hear it? Slowly.
yeah. Yeah.
Do you need a mic?
No.
Yeah, can you come up this way?
Oh,
The webinar.
oh, that's I was like, shit. All right.
Where is the microphone?
It's that.
Oh.
So, I guess I'll kind of be a discussant, and then I'll open it up for questions. Cool. I figured like that's probably the more traditional route. So I found the brief interesting. I read it last night, and
You didn't read all 170 pages?
No,
Oh.
I mean I did some of it. And I did have a couple things. I think, and you brought it up in the first slide here, things to like really think about. So the first one is like, the tenants build wealth simply by renting. And the truth is they do already. It just depends on how you kind of framed it where you're framing wealth as a function of home ownership or comparison to home ownership. And your first slide, and you kind of brought it as like you brought it up as like you have a sampling issue there. And you do, because for renters, for home ownership, or a selection problem, for home ownership, generally people that have, especially in the places that you were looking at, home ownership is highest, and really only home ownership is like attainable for those that are middle class or upper middle class, as well as have a higher level of education, are married, have children, right? So those are the
and homeowners are older.
Yeah, correct.
And that this is, those
so when
are
you
not
look at
controlling for that.
And you look at the renter side, you have the entire pot.
Yeah.
And so that first figure that you bring in is, and you acknowledge that it's misleading because the jump or the actual decision-making process of a family is occurring once those are fulfilled for the most part, those other characteristics. And so it's not necessarily that the rents are that people that are renting have lower wealth. Like, yes, that's true, but actually that disparity that you see declines dramatically when you compare and control for those just those four characteristics. Second,
how much, by the way? I've never looked at that. Is it like 80% or is it like 50%?
It's like 80%.
Okay.
But it's still
there. Yeah.
But then it goes.
And does controlling for that have a bigger or smaller effect for Black and Latino households?
So so that impact is it gets shrink dramatically. And then when you look at the asset accumulation of those specific for households that are actually making that decision at some point, you see that actually renters. So this is why I say actually they already are. They're putting their money, because they're typically higher educated, they're putting their money into 401ks and other retirement vehicles. And so, which are actually easier to liquefy or to liquidate than a house. And so, yes, while wealth is still, the wealth gap is still there, which is true, the access to wealth is dramatically different for those two populations. And some would argue actually when you control for that, then renters actually are not actually worse off. And so that's the first thing to think about, which means that so the apples to apples comparison in terms of like looking at rates of return for renters, you're really talking about a subset of the population,
Mhm.
right? And that subset is middle class. I'm just going to say middle class and individuals because that's the actual alternative for them is actually home ownership.
Right, right.
The beauty of what your program is really looking at is there a return on investment for lower income individuals?
Mhm.
And then I would argue, well, then it's not the comparison is not home ownership because that's not part of the decision making process for lower income families, especially.
Right, right.
But it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad project.
No,
I'm not
no.
throwing. What I'm saying is now the targets have shifted in terms of how we're thinking about rates of return. Does that make sense? So that's the first one. And
just because if you're middle class, you actually have the alternative of home ownership, and
correct.
you know, alternatively, you could put your money into your more money into your 401k. Whereas
correct. Or
if
like
you're lower income, you don't have
your-
a lot of money left over for
yeah,
certainly
so-
to buy or to invest
Exactly. No,
your
you do see
surplus.
a gap. You do see a gap. So, for example, I will say like renters have higher levels of consumption, even at like when you control for it. Why? Because their discretionary is more liquid. There's more liquid to their money's liquid. Also, because we know home ownership in the first 12 years is generally more expensive than it is for a renter, and so you need to. They do have extra money,
Yeah.
Which allows them to either build wealth or consume. Middle class families that are renting have that decision, whereas low income families they don't have the decision to put into investments. They're consuming, because they need to make ends meet.
Yeah,
Are more likely to make ends meet. So that was the first, like, I want to say critique, but just thoughts of like moving the target.
Critique away.
Yeah, moving the target. Or
that was our first episode of the podcast. Like I said, we've already recorded it.
Okay.
Haven't edited or published it, but basically the purpose of it, why we brought Bob on, is because I'd had a conversation with him while working on the report, and his questions were mostly like critical, probing, you know, based on his experience like working in the mortgage industry and the capital markets and so forth for decades. And but it was like constructive, you know, and so I'm very used to it, and I'm not trying to pretend like this program is perfect or I've thought it all through. These are the kinds of things that like help me work through.
I think the target is shifting a little bit, and that's okay. It just means that you might want to think of an alternative to a home ownership as something to compare it, especially you're essentially dichotomizing and saying, hey, this can work for this group. For this other group, it's going to be different because the choices that they have are actually different, which is why home ownership can be included in that.
Yeah.
For lower income families, like I said, the rate of return to compare it is just not. It's more difficult to compare because it's just not an option for them.
Yeah.
When they think about it. And the second thing to think about more deeply is I know you brought up high leverage, and in the report you brought up high leverage, and you use the examples of FHA and VA loans. But one thing to keep in mind is while it's important for us to think about them in terms of like a financial product that's high leverage, in fact, the government doesn't necessarily view them as such. We actually view it more in terms of monetary policy, where the reason we allow for high leverage loan products to exist through FHA or VA is actually because we want money to circulate in the economy. So the government doesn't, while we guarantee it, it's guaranteed because we know that there's secondary investors that are willing to buy it on the market, which allows the federal government as well as financial institutions to liquidate the loan product very quickly. So in other words, it gets onto the books of a pension, rather than
so the bank can lend out again.
Exactly. And so the purpose of the VA and the FHA in terms of high leverage is not actually, as much as we want to believe, it's to encourage home ownership, and we do.
That's what we're told, at least.
And it is a beautiful.
I would not own a home if not for the FHA loan. So
it's just that the role of the federal government, while it is not, while we use it as a vehicle to promote home ownership, the actual loan products themselves, the reason that we're allowed to have it be high leverage is because, or the guarantee of it, is actually for the purpose of moving money rapidly in the economy or liquidate money, and that we have actual investors ready to take. You can only do it is if there's investors ready to take this on. And so something to keep in mind.
Part of why they're willing to take it on is because the government basically says, like, if there's a foreclosure, we got you. Is that not right?
To a certain extent. I mean, they guarantee it only for well, that's
rather if there's a default.
Yeah, that's why it's extremely difficult to get. I mean, we have so many people, but yes, that is correct. But we guarantee. But part of the reason that we guarantee it is because we have so many loans and we have so many investors. And so it's not necessarily just like because they work with one another. If one of those hits, then the federal government would probably turn around and say, "Oh, I don't know if I can guarantee these anymore because they're hitting our books." And so just to keep in mind that or in the report is to think about like who are the types of investors or pension plans that would be the ones that can stabilize a guarantee rather than just assuming that the government will create a guarantee. It's actually it's a relationship between the two.
This came up Ian and Jacob at Mapcraft, Bob, lots of people brought this up, and it's a concept like I still only kind of get. You're much more in this world of the mortgage markets and so forth, the GSEs and everything. But I hear you. I think their message, as much as anything, was you need to know who you're trying to market this to, not to necessarily build the things, but actually who's going to buy the loan once it's issued, because the bank isn't going to want to keep that loan on its books for 30 years. Yeah.
So those are just things to keep in mind. And when I read it, I was like, oh, I would just like more information as to how you're thinking about this complex relationship rather than assuming that, oh, we just have these. And so we create them and guess what? It's there. But in reality, it's actually the purpose of those, both of the VA loan does have its own purpose because we got to like do well by for veterans. And I think that's what Congress pretends to think about. But the FHA, the idea is to improve homeownership, but actually the primary purpose of it is to move money from the Federal Reserve Bank and so forth. And so and I'm a homeownership guy, so I shouldn't have said that, but that's and so
giving it away.
I know. So so now I'm going to ask a couple of questions and then we'll open it up to everybody else. Okay. So the first thing that I guess I just want clarification or kind of like an understanding is that a big part of the benefits is that it kind of relies on a couple of two mechanisms, right? Either a sale or refinancing. And so part of the question is, and it's not, I don't know if it was incorporated into your modeling approach, but thinking about, and I know we hate this, but actually in real estate development, we have no choice but to do this, which is there has to be some form of thinking about timing. And more specifically, when credit markets are bad. Or they're tighter. And so how did you think about, like, in terms of the program that you're thinking about, especially today, because I assume Enterprise is going through this actually currently, which is we had a low interest market for the most part and now we are tightening up. So are there mechanisms or is there an implicit mechanism in the models that incorporates this like potential market credit tightening that could occur that may impact future and current interest rates or costs?
And that's the kind of thing that, as you said, is happening right now. It's something we tend not to appreciate as much when we think about it from the homeowner perspective, because you get a fixed rate 30-year loan and you just don't have to worry about that. But generally speaking, you're refinancing or selling every 7 or 10 years or so.
Exactly.
And so you can't just wait. You can't just wait until the optimal moment, because that might not happen in that, after 5 of the 7 years have passed. If you were expecting to refinance in year 7 and then year 7 rolls around and interest rates are like 2 percentage points higher, you're kind of screwed. I will say, for simplicity, we just every 7 years, consistent, assume the same terms. And the fact is, like, that would be very hard to guarantee. And so I don't think we have an answer, or I don't have an answer for how you do that. I can think of some ideas in terms of whether there's implicit or explicit subsidies that kind of stabilize things. Part of the idea of the long-term ownership, this is the model assumes basically indefinite ownership. You might sell to someone else who's operating it the same way, but not selling it, on the open market or whatever. And then like it converts to a traditional rental, for example. And I do think there is probably some benefit to that longer term perspective, that even if one refinance has to happen in a kind of bad year, in the long run, it's all going to kind of shake out. I do think there's real questions, and we do deal with this a lot in the program design kind of conversation. Uh, there's a lot of concern about like how you ensure that that one tenant in a building is treated basically the same as another. Because if you, for example, didn't do those average payments and you just had those spikes, big payments every 7 years, that could just be, the timing could work out such that one person lives there for five years or 7 years or 8 years and gets two payments. Another person lives there for 8 years and gets one of those big ones. So those kinds of things are another issue that I think is a little more easy to solve. But I think at the refinancing, yeah.
I would assume though, like those spikes I did see, I was like, oh, that's like automatically renter behaviors were going to change, right? Like I'm not moving until I get my big check.
Yeah.
Like people don't, like if you see the Fortune 500 coming, people don't quit their job until their bonus.
Yeah, yeah.
And like
and honestly, I would not want to encourage that kind of behavior, because that's like a complaint people have about home ownership, is it kind of keeps you in place longer than you otherwise would want to because of interest rates, because well, it's a buyer's market, not a seller's market, and like those kinds of things are a real concern. And so I would not want the like golden handcuffs idea applied to this rental program as well. But at some level, I think that's just like a program that has benefits is naturally going to have a little bit of that.
Well, yeah, I mean, anytime you have a tool, right, you're going to have consumers have to adjust and utilize the tool separately. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I just was like, oh, don't I actually
they're going to optimize.
Would not have, exactly. I would not have even thought of it as a concern. It's just like this is how people will adjust, right?
Yeah.
I guess people can think of it as a concern, but I actually, so I'm gonna do some positive. I know I just kind of went after it. And so I found this report interesting because in housing policy, we have, like, if you think about it in terms of two overarching debates, especially when we're thinking about wealth or housing policy related to ownership, right? We think about it in terms of like, should we prioritize affordability and decommodification of housing, or asset accumulation? And most scholars, I would argue, and including politicians, right, often focus. Actually, that's not true. Most scholars really focus on affordability and decommodification. I thought this was interesting because it's like saying, all right, we've done a lot on this. Let's see how we can think about asset accumulation in a positive way. And so I really like this because my work and a lot of people, 95% of the work that we see is actually on the other side. Like, how do we make things more affordable and just plainly decommodify housing? And you're playing with and said, like, well, actually, what if we actually focused on the asset accumulation part? And what does that look like for a group or a segment, in this case, renters, that normally would not have it? And so I guess the question I have for you is like, how are you trying to balance the two in creating this? And I'm just going to simply say, like, as a distinction between asset accumulation versus affordability.
Well, I think there's, my feeling was you are not going to level the playing field between ownership and renting by making ownership worse. Like, just politically, that's not happening. You're not going to cut the mortgage interest tax deduction or whatever more than was done. I mean, it was done. I guess that's maybe not the best example because they still exist though. But the subsidies to homeowners and just like the social boost it gets, I don't think we're going to take those away. That would just be very, very challenging to do. So I think somehow you have to make renting better, and no shade against like tenant advocates, but I don't think just rent control, just, certainly subsidies, because most people are not going to be eligible for them. And even right now, the people who are eligible mostly don't get any. So I think you have to offer something more than just like low prices or stability, because that's not exactly what people are getting when they go to home ownership. They're going for the asset accumulation. So like, I think you kind of have to fight on that turf. Otherwise, you're just conceding the battle or the war. So I think that's really how I thought about this. There's one other thing that I think is important, and it's escaped me, but you can ask another question and it'll probably come to me.
So I'll open it up for questions, and I'm gonna say, and then I think you can take your just point. Anyway, any questions?
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Miguel. I'm a public policy student at kind of going off of what, Professor Loya said, in terms of like focusing on the tenants, you know, I have two questions that kind of like you might be able to answer at the same time. First one is like, how would eligibility look into it? Is there gonna be like a universal, like, these are the kind of renters you need to, have? And how will the wealth be paid out? Like, is it gonna be through investments or direct cash? How would that be taxed? Because like that at the end is it gonna be considered income? Because that will affect, those families that are on, government resource, government programs. Will they become ineligible now because of this extra income?
It's a good question. So for the first one, there's like a 20 something page appendix just of like discussion of different program design elements. And these are most of them, not all of them. But you can see kind of the middle upper right, table 15 eligibility there. So there were some ideas there. You could have it unrestricted, just anyone who applies can get in, just like any other rental. You could have it limited to people who don't own homes. You could have it limited by income. You could have it limited by wealth. You could combine any of these. I think those three are in bold because I think all of those are desirable in different ways and maybe should be explored. But I do think certainly like early on, if this is a pretty limited program only available to a small share of the people who would like to participate, it makes sense to me to limit it to people who don't already have, a means of building wealth through property, land ownership, real estate. So on eligibility, I think that's kind of where I came down. But I think there are other things you could consider too. Like you have to consider fair housing law and other things. So I missed. When I was looking for this, I missed part of your second question, but I think it was essentially there's like this could be treated as income, and if you're like receiving other public benefits, this might put you over a threshold, essentially.
Yeah, so like,
Yeah.
is it gonna be put towards like an investment account, that later gets, the tenants could access later when they're retiring or withdraw however they want? Or is it gonna be direct cash, like, that they have to report during the next year?
So the way it's put in here is you're just getting a payment every year. There's no reason it would have to be structured that way. You could even imagine maybe for people for whom that's a concern, they go the investment route so that it's not hitting their income, and maybe it's like effectively a 401k or something where you can't access it until retirement, or maybe you can only use it for things like buying a home or certain other education fund for your kids or something like that. Um, but I think these are the kinds of things I would love to get to the point where we have to worry about that. But I think it is an important question. It's not something I thought about, and so I do appreciate you bringing it up because it would be something that would become an issue for some people. Who knows?
Could this create the potential to create kind of macroeconomic risks in the housing market by making it a lot easier to access loans since you don't need very much equity?
I mean, I think yes, at some level. I am not the best person to answer how much. Um, I think an interesting thing about the modeling for this that Ian at Mapcraft told me is even though we set the model so that the maximum loan to value is 90%, 90% loan, 90% or 10% equity, none of the models actually achieved that because of other limitations on like the debt service coverage ratio and other things. So in practice, it was not that high of leverage. I think there's other reasons. I don't think the risk should be dismissed. I think it's something like we should all look at head on and figure out how to mitigate as best we can. But just to give some reasons, I think maybe it might not be as big an issue as people might initially think is, one of the big ones for me is home prices are much more volatile than rents. And so you would think that the odds of, the value of a property dropping by 15%, a rental property, are much smaller than the odds of a home dropping in value by 15%. And so, the risk of coming underwater might be quite a bit lower. The other thing is getting back to the issue of like how do you avoid people paying above market rents to live in this housing? a kind of flip side to that is I think you could set things so that when someone moves in, they're paying essentially what they would pay for a similar market rate unit in a traditional rental. But once they're in, maybe there's a little more flexibility on if the neighboring property had to lower rents by 5% last year because, a change in the market, something like what's happened in Austin the past couple of years, um, then maybe you wouldn't lower it as much in this shared prosperity rental housing, and that would be kind of a way of offsetting this. And if that were the case, that people would probably be willing to kind of pay that, then the hit to the value of those properties, the SPR properties, would be smaller than the other properties where rents fell more. So I think those are a few reasons that maybe it's not as big a problem. But another thing to consider is maybe 90% loan to value is too high. Maybe 80% is more appropriate. It would still make a pretty big difference.
And one of the other, you mentioned one of the pilot programs,
Mhm.
and they were having trouble getting tenants signed up. Do you think that some element of that is people just distrusting developers and maybe a developer being a bad actor, not paying out tenants?
Yeah, and I'm realizing I'm not even sure if that story I'm telling is from Enterprise or from I know someone who owns a company called Viva, and they have like a private version of this. It could have been him, but in any case, I think trust is 100% a problem, and I don't think it would even be like unique to developers or landlords. Maybe it's extra high for them, but it's just like the business owner, the rich guy, whatever. Obviously, Enterprise like operates and funds exclusively affordable housing, as far as I know, like deed restricted affordable housing for low income households. And so they're in a somewhat different position. And there's already been a lot more, paperwork and other things that have gone into someone living in one of those units. Um, so that's why I'm thinking like maybe it wasn't them and maybe it was this private one. But in any case, like it was surprising to me, but also once I heard it, it was not so surprising. It kind of made sense. I understood where it comes from, and it's just the kind of thing that like I think would not occur to most people, and just why you have to try these things out in different ways and see where the pain points are. You're going to be able to predict some, but some are going to be completely unexpected. Did you have a question back here?
With the rents, like, it would be just market rate rents, like, for renters going in. So I think like my concern with that, right, would be then that would exclude low income renters. So then how can we create, like, for this type of program, how would you create more equity then? Because then the only people that would be able to access this wealth that you're trying to create
Mhm.
to like level the playing field, it's gonna be like middle income or like, higher.
Yeah. So a couple of things on that, which is a really good question, a question I got a lot. And even people who were interested in the program, like from a lender side, that kind of thing, this was a concern for them just from a like reputation perspective of like not helping the people who need it most. One thing I want to reiterate is the goal here is to not take public subsidies. And so this is not something that is taking away from anyone. Um, Another thing is there is, one thing we do talk about is we build projects in Los Angeles all the time. I think there is a cost to this, but they still are often feasible that are mixed income. Might be 10, 15% affordable at a very low income, extremely low income level. And those units pencil out, they are profitable. And so those units, those same requirements, you would presume that those would still be in place. So whatever percentage the city required to be built affordable and operated for 55 years as affordable would be in this program and be affordable. Um, I think there is a challenge, though, especially once you get into income restricted housing, where it's already subsidized at a price in Los Angeles of hundreds of thousands of dollars per unit. And so there is not anything actually left over to distribute. The benefit is the low rent. In Los Angeles, it's often 40%, 50%, 60% or more below market rate. And so it is just a fact that it is challenging, if not impossible, without just more subsidies, to then also, in addition to very low rents, give money back. There's just a choice that we have to make. And that's why subsidies are used for lowering rents. Because to the point I was making a little while ago, I do think the value of just having low rents month to month is much greater, especially the lower your income compared to I'm going to get a payoff, once a year or 5 years down the road or that kind of thing. But I think it is a real challenge. And it's why, I'm personally a big advocate for not only something like this, but spending, let's say, 10 times more on housing vouchers and low-income housing tax credit and programs like that. There's no reason these things can't go hand in hand. Adam, someone different. I can't get you though.
Thanks. I had one comment and one question. And the comment is kind of you got to discussing with Jose, that it seems that if I can characterize it, that you're using this financing to create a surplus, right? And then the question is how you distribute that surplus. Is it through kind of more immediate, like cash back, like rent rebates, or like a longer term, like lump sum, which helps to build wealth, right? And in either situation, as you said, you end up in a situation you kind of have to regulate rents.
Yeah.
So that surplus isn't just captured by the developer or landowner.
Yeah.
So for those really interesting, that trade-off between the short and the long term rebate. And then the question is how you, if you move towards this equity stake, how you stop renters behaving like homeowners. And what I mean by that, I mean, you mentioned some of the plus side, right? That a stake in like maintaining the building. But if I'm like seeing a $200,000 payout on a wall, I need to get my neighbor evicted. That's what I see. Seriously, I mean, especially if they're like paying below market rent or they're delinquent on their rent. And I want to stop a rental building going up next door that's going to dig into that equity. So, like, how do you like deal with this change of incentives for renters?
I think that first example of like getting the neighbor out who's paying below market rent, that could be an issue in like rent stabilized housing and that kind of thing. That could be true, and that's something I hadn't really thought about. Yeah, exactly. And there's a million ways people get around that all the time. So that is a real thing. On the acting more like it's funny, acting more like homeowners, acting more NIMBY, because homeowners just are more NIMBY than renters on average. And it seems like becoming a homeowner actually causes that to some extent. It's not just like, again, more NIMBY people are selecting themselves into homeownership. It's something about owning a home that makes you more defensive of, your neighborhood character and the value of your property and so forth. And it's like easy to understand why that is. The ironic thing is actually before anything else, at some level, the genesis of this project for me was like, how do we have more renters? Because renters are more pro-housing, they're more pro-tenant, they're more progressive generally than homeowners. And so like, if we could just have more renters, that would be great for that reason. But again, we have to make renting actually attractive in comparison to homeownership. So that's not to say what you're saying is not real. I do think, one response I would give to that though is you're talking about, we want our property value of the building we live in to go up. And so one way we can do that is by preventing other housing from being built nearby, which is true. The trade-off there though is in the case of a homeowner, if everything gets more expensive, my monthly payment doesn't change if I have a fixed rate mortgage, or even if it's an adjustable rate. If I'm a renter, you're presuming that like you're paying the market rate for your unit. And so if it gets more expensive, you're paying more as well. And like, yeah, maybe you're getting 20%, 30% of that back optimistically, but like you're paying the other 70% or 80% is just like more money out of your pocket. So there is still actually an incentive for you to want things to remain more affordable.
We have time for one more
Yes.
quick question.
Is there anyone who hasn't asked one? There you go.
Kind of along the same lines that you were just talking about, but on the reverse side, right? Market values for rents and homes in the properties in the neighborhood how would that be affected? You know, would you expect market rents to eventually go down while the program rents stay the same? Or, and like, who would be the opposition, right? What group,
Mhm.
what parties would oppose this program?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure. You could imagine like if there were enough of these kinds of units that were exactly the same price as similar units on the market, that there would be some downward pressure on those other units that people might be willing to pay less. Um, I think in practice that might not be the case because it's not like there's more homes on the market, and the let's say the shared prosperity rental homes, there's gonna be a lot more applicants to those than there would have been in the past. And so if there might be like more demand in the neighborhood overall, if it's just one place, you know this could like kind of average out if the program existed and had buildings all over. Um, but obviously, like existing landlords of like just a traditional project would be major opponents of this, which I think is an important thing to think about. They are a powerful lobby, and that's true in California. It's true in across the country, and um, other than them, I mean, that's the obvious one. I'm trying to think like how homeowners might interpret this. I think there would be a little bit of the like student loan forgiveness. I paid my bills, so other people should have to suffer too. Um, I think there would be a little bit of that from some homeowners where they're like, why should they have it easy? But overall, I don't think you would get a whole lot of that, or wouldn't be, be maybe pretty muted, especially if you're not like subsidizing things. And there's also there's the case you can make that, again, this is helping more people become homeowners, that the people living in these units are going to act more like homeowners. They're going to stay longer. The whole concern about like transients and all that kind of stuff might be muted. So I think there's arguments on both sides, but if I had to guess, most of the, strongest opposition would be more like the people operating rentals as they are now. But of course, they would be welcome to shift over themselves. All right. These are great questions. Thank you all for being here and for asking such great questions. Appreciate it.